The bullet had been in Robert Keating's side for 3 days before Maggie Merriweather found him bleeding out behind her chicken coop, and the moment she pressed her hand to his wound and felt the heat of his fever burning through his shirt, she knew her quiet life in Caldwell, Kansas was about to become something else entirely. It was the autumn of 1882, and the cattle drives had slowed to a trickle through town, leaving Caldwell in that peculiar in-between state where the saloons still hummed, but the streets ran quieter than summer. Maggie had been a widow for 2 years by then, having buried her husband Thomas Merriweather after a fever took him in the spring of 1880. She was 31 years old, brown-haired and steady-handed, with green eyes that people in Caldwell said could see clean through a man's excuses before he even opened his mouth. She ran a small boarding house on the western edge of town, kept a kitchen garden, raised chickens, and carried herself with the particular dignity of a woman who had decided that grief was not something she would wear on her sleeve for the whole town to see. She had woken before dawn that particular October morning, because one of her hens had been making a racket that no sensible hen should be making in the cold dark. Maggie pulled on her boots, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out into the biting prairie air with a lantern held ahead of her. The chickens settled almost immediately, which told her the disturbance had been something larger than a weasel. She walked around the side of the coop and stopped. The man was lying on his stomach in the dirt, one arm stretched out ahead of him as though he had been crawling before he stopped. He was big, broad across the shoulders, wearing a dust-colored coat that had seen considerable abuse. Even from 3 feet away, she could see the dark stain spreading across his left side. She knelt immediately, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his throat, and found a pulse that was thin and unsteady but present. She did not scream. She did not run for the sheriff. She did what she had always done, which was think first and panic later if the situation absolutely demanded it. She rolled him carefully onto his back, and his face caught the lantern light. He was perhaps 33 or 34, lean-jawed with several days of dark stubble, and even in unconsciousness there was something around his mouth that suggested a man who had spent a long time keeping his feelings locked behind his teeth. There was a bruise along his left cheekbone and a cut above his brow that had crusted over. The wound in his side was the serious one. She could see the entry point just below his ribs, and the way the fabric around it had dried black told her the bleeding had slowed but not stopped. She made a decision. She told herself afterward that it was not a decision driven by anything other than simple human decency, and mostly she believed herself. Getting him inside was the hardest part. He was dead weight, and Maggie Merriweather was a slender woman of modest build, but she was stronger than she looked because 2 years of running a boarding house alone had made her that way. She found a piece of canvas behind the barn, rolled him onto it, and dragged him across the yard and through the back door of her house, through the kitchen, and into the small storeroom at the rear of the hall that had a cot in it for the times when a boarder arrived late. She got him onto the cot, cut his coat and shirt away with her sewing scissors, and set her lantern on the shelf above him. The bullet was still inside him. She could feel the hard knot of it just inside the wound when she pressed careful fingers along the flesh. She had pulled 2 bullets from men before, once from her husband Thomas, who had caught a ricochet during a fence dispute in the early days of their marriage, and once from old Peterson, the blacksmith who had shot himself in the thigh cleaning his own pistol. She was not a doctor, but Dr. Ames in Caldwell was a man who drank too much and talked even more, and Maggie had already decided she was not bringing him into this. She boiled water. She found the bottle of carbolic acid she kept in her medicine cabinet. She heated a needle and thread and laid out her sharpest knife and a pair of thin-nosed pliers she used for needlework. Then she poured herself a small glass of whiskey from the bottle she kept for medicinal purposes, drank half of it, and set to work. He came around twice during the procedure. The first time he gripped her wrist so hard she thought he would crush it, his eyes wide and disoriented and burning with fever. She said his name, though she did not know his name yet, so she said nothing at all, just spoke in a low, steady voice. She said, "You are safe. Stop moving or I will lose you." Her voice was calm enough that he let go, and his eyes went out of focus again like a lamp being turned down. The second time he came around, she had the pliers inside the wound, and she would not stop for anything in the world. He made a sound that she would not soon forget, a sound that had nothing theatrical about it, just pure involuntary pain, and she said, "Nearly there. Hold on," and he did. When she dropped the bullet into the tin bowl beside her and began to close the wound, she realized her hands were trembling slightly. She steadied them. She stitched the wound closed with the neat small stitches she used on quilts, cleaned everything with carbolic acid, and bound his side with strips of clean linen. Then she sat back in the wooden chair and looked at him, and her heart was doing something complicated that she did not examine too closely. He slept for the better part of 2 days. She kept her boarders out of that room. She told the 2 men currently staying with her, a surveyor named Hanford and an older cattle buyer named Pierce, that there was a sick cousin visiting. Neither of them seemed particularly interested. She brought Robert Keating broth when she could get it down him, changed his dressings twice daily, and sat with him in the evenings because the fever, when it climbed, made him restless in a way that could open the wound again. On the second night, when the fever was at its highest and he was speaking in half-formed sentences that she could not entirely follow, she caught one phrase clearly. He said, "I did not start out this way." She sat very still in the chair beside the cot and listened to him say it twice more, each time with a different inflection, once like a defense and once like a confession. She folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. He woke clearly on the third day, just after noon. She had been cutting carrots at the kitchen table when she heard the sound of him trying to stand up and immediately thought of all the stitching she was about to have to redo. She came into the room to find him sitting upright on the edge of the cot with his feet on the floor, one hand pressed to his bandaged side, looking around the room with the careful measuring expression of a man trying to quickly assess where he was and whether he needed to leave. He saw her and went very still. She leaned in the doorway with her arms crossed and looked at him. "You are going to tear my stitches," she said. "Where am I?" His voice was rough from disuse and fever, but underneath it there was a particular quality, something measured and educated that she had not expected. "You are in my house," she said. "My name is Maggie Merriweather. You were behind my chicken coop. You had a bullet in you." He looked at her for a long moment. "You pulled it." "I did." He looked down at the bandaging that showed above the waistband of his trousers. She had cut his shirt away and replaced it with a clean linen cover. He seemed to register this. "I owe you a considerable debt," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You do. Can you tell me your name?" He looked at her for a beat longer than was quite natural, and she watched the small war cross his face. "Robert," he said. "Robert Keating." She recognized the name. She did not show that she recognized it. She had heard it spoken in the saloon last spring when 2 cowboys passing through had been talking about a man known as Keating who rode with a loose outfit called the Crane Creek Boys, men who had been running a moderately successful cattle rustling operation across the territory. She had not paid it much mind at the time because the saloon and its conversations were not her primary concern, but the name had stuck somewhere in the back of her mind, the way names do when they are attached to a story that is in some way tragic. She simply nodded. "Can you drink broth, Robert Keating?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then lie back down and I will bring you some." He lay back, though she could tell from the set of his jaw that he found the act of following her instructions without argument somewhat against his general nature. She brought him broth and he drank it. She brought him water and he drank that too. She changed his dressings that evening, working with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything, and he watched her hands the whole time she worked with an expression she could not quite name. Not suspicion exactly. More like a man who was trying to memorize something he did not believe he would see again. "You did good work," he said, meaning the stitching. "I have had practice," she said, "doctoring, farming." And 2 years of being the only person around here who will do things that need doing." He was quiet for a moment. "Your husband died 2 years ago," she said without particular emotion. She had long since made peace with saying those words. He did not offer condolences, which she appreciated more than she could say. The condolences of strangers always felt like a light coat of paint over something that went much deeper. Instead, he just said, "I am sorry," and the brevity of it carried more weight than anything elaborate would have. "How long have you been out there?" she asked. 3 days, I think, maybe 4, I lost count." "You could have died." "I know it." "Who shot you?" Another small war on his face, and she watched it without hurrying him. "A man named Carlyle," he said finally. "Amos Carlyle. He runs the outfit I was riding with. We had a disagreement about the direction of things." She suspected the direction of things had been whether to turn to worse crimes than cattle rustling. She had heard enough over the past 2 years from men passing through her boarding house to know that that particular crossroads was not an uncommon one for men in certain lines of work. "Is he going to come looking for you?" "No," Robert said, and there was something in his voice that told her the disagreement between him and Carlyle had left Carlyle with something to think about too. "He will leave me be. He has more pressing concerns." She nodded once and let it rest. Over the next week, she fell into an unexpected rhythm with him. He was not an easy patient in the sense of being passive or docile, but he was a reasonable one. He did not demand things. He ate what she brought him and said thank you each time. He slept long hours as his body worked on healing itself. When he was awake and she was in the room, they talked, which surprised her. She had not expected to talk to him. She had expected to nurse him in efficient silence and then send him on his way, which was the sensible plan and the safe one. But he asked her questions. Not intrusive questions, not questions designed to wedge open anything she wanted to keep closed, but genuine questions. He asked about the boarding house, how she had come to run it, whether it was profitable, whether she liked it. He asked about the town. He asked with great care about her garden, because he could see it through the small window of the storeroom, and he said the organization of it suggested a particular kind of mind. "What kind of mind?" she asked. "One that plans for the season ahead while also dealing with the season at hand," he said. "Most people do one or the other." She looked at him with something that was part assessment and part surprise. "You are more observant than I expected." "I have spent a good deal of time being still and watching things," he said. "It is an occupational requirement in my line of work." "Your former line of work," she said pointedly. He held her gaze for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Former." She did not ask him to clarify that. She simply accepted the word at face value and went back to her tasks. He had been with her for 8 days when he was well enough to sit up at the kitchen table for meals, and the first time he came to the table and sat across from her, she felt something shift in the room. It was the kind of shift she had not felt in 2 years, a kind of electricity in the air, specific and personal. She kept her eyes on her plate and told herself it was simply the strangeness of having a man at her table again. He told her over those meals about where he came from, not all of it, not the outlaw parts in any detail, but the beginning. He was from St. Louis. His father had been a bookkeeper who died when Robert was 17, leaving a small debt and a large family. He had a mother and 3 younger sisters. He had gone west at 18, the year 1867, with the idea of building something. He had worked cattle legitimately for several years, had been cheated out of a season's wages by a rancher named Devereaux in Texas who had connections with the law there, and had then made a series of decisions that he described with the flat, honest tone of a man who was not going to make excuses for himself, but who also needed someone to know they had been decisions made in anger and desperation, rather than in pure cold greed. "You were not born an outlaw," she said, which echoed back to her the sentence she had heard him speak in his fever. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "I was not." Where did it go wrong? She was not asking to judge him. She asked with genuine curiosity, the way she asked about everything. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I let myself stop believing it could go right," he said. "There is a particular moment for men like me. You stop thinking in terms of building and start thinking only in terms of surviving. And once you stop thinking about building, it gets very easy to justify a great number of things." It was the most honest thing she had ever heard a man say about himself, and she was quiet for a long moment after, the coffee steam rising between them. "Can it be reversed?" she asked. "The decision or the things that came from it?" "Both." He was quiet for a long time. "The decision, yes. The things that came from it, not entirely, but I have been thinking for some time that I am done. And now I am more certain of it than I have ever been," he said. He was looking at her while he said it, and she did not look away. That night she lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and had a long, serious conversation with herself. She was a sensible woman. She was 31 years old. She had built something fragile and real from the wreckage of Thomas's death, this boarding house, this garden, this life, and she was not in the habit of throwing sensible things away for romantic ones. Robert Keating was a wanted man, probably. He was a man who had been doing wrong by the law for years. He would ride away the moment he was healed, and that was correct and proper, because a man like that had no business in a respectable widow's house. She acknowledged all of this clearly and completely. And then she thought about the way he had watched her hands while she changed his dressings, and the way he said please and thank you with a sincerity that had nothing performed about it, and the way he had described his own failures without self-pity and without excuse, and she thought that she was in considerable difficulty. She went to sleep reminding herself to be sensible. She woke up thinking of him. By the 10th day he was helping her with small tasks, insisting on it really, despite her insistence that he rest. She found him in the kitchen one morning chopping kindling with a methodical efficiency that told her he had done it many times. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before he heard her. "You are going to pull your stitches," she said. "I chopped wood before I could read," he said, without turning around. "My body remembers." She came into the kitchen and put water on for coffee. He finished the kindling and stacked it neatly beside the stove, then came and sat at the table. She could see from the careful way he lowered himself into the chair that his side was still talking to him, but she said nothing because she knew a man's pride when she saw it. "Tell me about your husband," he said. It was abrupt enough that she looked up at him. "Why?" "Because you are here and he is not, and it seems like that is a considerable story." She was quiet for a moment, then she sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "He was steady and kind, and he worked himself very hard. He was not an exciting man, which I mean as no disrespect. He was solid the way good wood is solid. I loved him." "But," Robert said quietly, she looked at him. "But nothing. I loved him." "I am not suggesting there should be a but. I am just listening." She thought for a moment. "We were not of one mind exactly about what we wanted. He wanted the farm. He would have been perfectly content to farm the same 100 acres forever. I wanted," she paused, "more than I could quite name, not more material things, more something, more conversation, more being known." She said it quickly as though she needed to get past it before she thought better of saying it. "That sounds terrible given that he is dead." "It sounds human," Robert said. "He was a good man," she said again. "I heard you," he said gently. "You don't have to defend him to me." She looked at him for a long moment, and felt something ease in her chest that she had not known was tight. It was on the 14th day that everything changed in the town. She had gone to Fletcher's general store for flour and salt, the ordinary errands of an ordinary morning, and she came back to find her boarder Pierce waiting on the porch with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that meant he was about to tell her something she would not want to hear. "Marshall Boone was in Fletcher's," Pierce said. "He is looking for a man." Maggie kept her face very still. "Is he?" "Big fellow, dark hair, went by the name Keating. They say he used to ride with the Crane Creek outfit. There is a federal warrant out." "I see," Maggie said. "Thank you for telling me." She went inside. She set her flour on the kitchen shelf. She went to the storeroom and stood in the doorway. Robert was sitting on the cot with one of Thomas's old newspapers, and he looked up at her and read her face immediately, which she noticed and did not find surprising. "Someone is looking," she said. "Boone," she stared at him. "You know him. I know of him. He has been on my trail for the better part of a year. There is a federal warrant." He set the newspaper down and looked at the floor for a moment, then looked up at her. His expression was composed, but she had been watching him for 2 weeks now, and she could see the weight behind his eyes. "I need to go," he said. "You cannot ride. You will tear the stitches and you will bleed out in the prairie, and I will have pulled a bullet out of a dead man for no practical purpose." He almost smiled at that. "Maggie, give it 2 more days," she said. "Boone is not going to search boarding houses. He is going to ride the saloon circuit and ask questions and then move on. They always do. You do not know that." "I know Caldwell," she said. "2 more days, then you go." He looked at her for a long time. "Why are you doing this?" She thought about giving him a practical answer. She had a practical answer ready. But she looked at him sitting there with his dark eyes steady on hers, and she found the practical answer had dissolved. "I do not entirely know," she said honestly, "but I am asking you to trust me for 2 more days." He nodded slowly. "2 more days," he said. She moved him that afternoon. She had a root cellar beneath the house, accessed by a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, and she had made it as comfortable as she could with the second cot from the barn and several blankets. It was not a pleasant space, but it was a safe one, and Robert went down into it without complaint, which told her something about the kind of man he was when the situation was serious. Marshal Boone came to her door the following morning. She had known he would come eventually, because Boone was not a fool. He was a compact, serious man of about 50 with a gray mustache and eyes like river stones, flat and patient. He tipped his hat to her and apologized for the disturbance and asked if she had taken on any new boarders recently. She said she had 2 gentlemen with her currently, Hanford the surveyor and Pierce the cattle buyer, both of whom she had known in passing for years, and who could certainly speak to their own business if the marshal wished to verify. Boone looked at her with his riverstone eyes for a moment that went on just slightly too long. "You would not be harboring anyone, Mrs. Merriweather." "I would not," she said, and she said it with the particular serenity of a woman who had made peace with difficult decisions and was not going to be rattled out of them. He tipped his hat again and left. She waited until he was off her road, and then she went back to the kitchen and lifted the trapdoor and looked down at Robert, who was sitting on the cot in the lamplight with his hands folded and his expression very calm. "He is gone," she said. "I heard," he said. "How much of that did you hear?" "Enough," he said. His voice was quiet. "Maggie, come up," she said. "There is coffee." He climbed up slowly, wincing only once, and sat at the table, and she poured him coffee, and for a while neither of them said anything. The morning sun came through the east window and laid a rectangle of gold across the floorboards. "That was a considerable risk you just took," he said finally. "Yes, for a wanted outlaw. For a man," she said, "who is trying to stop being one." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the rectangle of gold moved slowly across the floor between them in the silence. That afternoon she found him in the garden. He had gone out there while she was with her boarders, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched him for a moment before going out. He was standing at the edge of the winter vegetable bed with his hat in his hands, looking at it with the same focused attention he brought to most things. She came and stood beside him. "You have planned for frost," he said. "It comes early here." "I know. I have been through this country in November." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to keep a garden," he said. "When I was a boy, my mother's. She grew everything she could because there was never enough money for the market." "What did she grow?" He listed things: carrots, potatoes, turnips, beans. He said his favorite thing had been the beans in August, the way the pods felt when they were full and ready. He said it with such particular detail that she could see him clearly, the boy he had been, and she felt the familiar ache that certain kinds of stories produce, the ache of knowing what was lost. "Do you ever write to your mother?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "She died while I was riding with the Crane Creek boys," he said. "I was not there. I did not even know for 2 months after. I got a letter from my sister Jane forwarded through a town I had passed through." He paused. "That was when I knew I had let myself become something I should not have become, but it is the kind of knowing that takes time to act on. She did not say she was sorry. She knew the shape of that kind of loss. Instead, she said, "Your sisters are still in St. Louis. Jane is, and Clara. Lissy married and went to Ohio, I think." He looked at the garden for another moment. "I have not been in contact with any of them in 4 years." "You could fix that," she said. He looked at her sideways. When you go," she said. She kept her voice even. "When you leave here, you could go north and east. Go back to St. Louis. Write to them first so it is not a surprise." He said nothing for a long moment. "You are making plans for me. Someone should. Maggie." His voice was different when he said her name this time. It had a quality she had not heard in it before, something soft and careful, the way you hold something fragile. She turned and looked at him. The autumn sun was behind him, and the light was the particular honey-colored light of late afternoon in Kansas, and he was looking at her with an expression that left no room for misinterpretation. "Do not," she said quietly, not harshly. "Do not, Robert. You are leaving in 2 days." "I know I am leaving," he said. "That does not change what is true. What is true will make it harder." "It is already hard," he said simply. She turned away and looked at the garden and said nothing for a while, and he stood beside her and also said nothing, which was one of the things she had come to value deeply about him in these 2 weeks. He knew when to let silence work. "I have been alone for 2 years," she said finally, "and I have been all right. I have built something here, something small but real, and I am not going to be a woman who falls to pieces over a man who is going to ride away." "You are not falling to pieces," he said. "You are the least likely person I have ever met to fall to pieces." "Then do not give me reason to consider it." He looked at her with something that might have been a smile, except there was too much sadness in it to call it that entirely. "If I were not what I am," he said. "But you are," she said, "and that is the end of it." She walked back to the house, and he followed her at a respectful distance, and neither of them mentioned it again that night. But she lay awake again for a very long time. On the 15th day, she checked his stitches for what she knew would be the last time. He sat on the edge of the cot, and she unwrapped the bandaging and examined the wound with careful fingers. It had healed well, cleanly, the stitches holding and the flesh around them looking healthy rather than angry. She was proud of her work in a detached, professional way, and she told him so. "You will want to keep it clean," she said, winding fresh linen around his side. "Change this every day for another week. After that the stitches can come out." "How do I take them out?" "Very small scissors and patience," she said. "Someone can do it for you in the next town. Or I can do it myself." "If you must," she said. She tied off the bandage and smoothed it. Her hands stilled on his ribcage for a moment, just one moment, before she withdrew them, and she heard his breathing change. "Maggie," he said. "Stand up," she said briskly. "Let me see how you walk." He stood. He walked the length of the room and back. His stride was even, and he held himself straight without obvious pain. She nodded. "You can ride tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. She had gone back to the kitchen by the time she heard him follow her, and when she turned around he was standing in the doorway. He had washed his face and combed his hair, and he was wearing the clean shirt she had given him, one of Thomas's shirts from the cedar chest that she had told herself she was giving away out of pure practicality. He was holding his hat. He looked in that moment like a man who had decided something clearly and was not going to be talked out of it. "I need to tell you something," he said. "You do not have to," she said. "I need to," he said. "Before I go, I need you to know." She stood very still in the kitchen and let him speak. He said, "I have not had a home in 15 years. I have not sat at a table like a human being in I cannot tell you how long. I have not had a conversation, a real one, since before I can remember. I have not wanted to stay somewhere since I was 17 years old." He paused and looked at her directly, the way he did everything, without flinching. "I want to stay here. I want you to know that. I want to stay, and I know I cannot, and I want you to know that I know why. I know what I am and what I have been, and I am not going to ask you to carry that. But I need you to know that you are the first person in 15 years who made me believe it was possible to be something better. And that is not nothing. That is, in fact." He stopped and looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. The most important thing that has happened to me in my adult life." She stood in the kitchen and listened to every word, and she kept her face very still because she was determined not to cry, and she did not cry, but it was a very near thing. "Robert," she said, and her voice was quiet, "you do not have to say anything. I know." She turned to the window for a moment and looked at the garden in the last of the afternoon light. Then she turned back. "Are you truly done with it, all of it?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "What will you do?" "I am going to St. Louis," he said. "I am going to find my sisters. I am going to do whatever honest work I can find. I was a good hand with cattle before I was a thief of them, and there is still cattle work to be found, or something else. I do not know exactly. But I know the direction." She looked at him for a long time. "Good," she said finally. "That is good, Robert. Will you write to me?" he asked. "If I send you an address, I know it is an unusual thing to ask." She thought about the sensible answer. She had the sensible answer ready, the one about how it would be improper and complicated and serve neither of them well. "Yes," she said, "I will write to you." His expression shifted in a way that she found almost unbearable to look at because it was pure uncalculated relief, the expression of a man who has been very thirsty and has just been given water. "Thank you," he said, meaning the letter but also meaning more than the letter. "Eat your supper," she said, because she needed to do something practical immediately or she was going to abandon practicality entirely. He ate his supper. They sat at the table and talked about ordinary things, the weather turning colder, the price of flour, whether the railroad would reach further south by next summer, and all of it felt unbearably domestic and right and temporary. He was up before dawn the next morning. She heard him moving and got up herself, and she was in the kitchen before him with coffee made and biscuits from last night wrapped in cloth. He came through the kitchen door with his coat on, and his hat in his hand, and his saddlebags over his shoulder. His horse, which he had brought in from where it had apparently wandered and survived in the scrub west of town while he lay bleeding behind her coop, was tied to the back fence. She had fed it herself without telling him. She handed him the coffee. He drank it standing up because there was not much time. "The Hanford man was asking questions last night," she said, "about the cousin who has been here. I heard. He is not a bad man, but he is a curious one. I understand." He finished the coffee and set the cup on the counter. Then he reached into his coat and took out a folded piece of paper and put it on the table. "My sister Jane's address," he said. "In case you write before I have a permanent one of my own, she will forward it." She looked at the paper. She picked it up and folded it smaller and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. He said, "There is something else." He was looking at her with that careful, steady look that she had come to know as his most honest expression. "What I whispered the other night, when the fever was bad." She looked at him. "I meant it," he said, "every word." She had been sitting close by him that night. The night 3 days ago when he had woken at 2 in the morning with the fever briefly climbing again, and had reached out in the dark and found her hand on the edge of the cot. He had held her hand and turned his face toward her and whispered something that she had heard clearly and had carried inside her like a thing precious and burning since. He had whispered that he loved her, not with the dramatic speech of a man making a declaration, but with the flat, honest simplicity of a man recognizing a fact. He had said it quietly, the way you say something you have known for a while, and her hand had tightened on his, and neither of them had spoken again that night. "I know you meant it," she said. "I wanted to say it to your face as well," he said, "so there is no question." She looked at him for a long moment in the pre-dawn kitchen, the lantern making shadows move across the walls. She crossed the small space between them and stood very close to him and put her hand flat against his chest over the clean shirt she had given him. "Come back when you are an honest man," she said. "Not the memory of one, not the intention of one, an actual one with time behind you." He looked down at her hand and then at her face. "How long?" "Long enough," she said. "You will know." He put his hand over hers, the large, warm weight of it, and held it there for a moment. Then he bent his head and pressed his lips to her forehead, not a desperate gesture, a gentle one, a reverent one, the kind that carries more than passion carries. He stepped back. He picked up the cloth of biscuits from the counter. He put his hat on. "Maggie Merriweather," he said, and there was everything in the way he said her full name, the way you say a place you want to come back to. "Robert Keating," she said. He went out the back door. She heard his horse move away from the fence. She went to the window and watched the gray pre-dawn swallow him up in the direction of the north road, and she stood there until there was nothing to see, and then she stood there a little longer. She never told anyone what he had whispered before he rode away. Not Pierce, not Hanford, not her neighbor Ruth Carey, who was her closest friend in Caldwell, not Dr. Ames, not the women at the Sunday gathering where quilts were made and gossip flowed as freely as spring water. She carried it inside her the way she carried everything important, quietly and completely. The weeks passed. October folded into November and the cold settled over the Kansas plain with a gray seriousness. Maggie ran her boarding house. She tended her garden through the first frosts. She rode in the evenings by lamplight and took on more mending work than she strictly needed because she found that her hands needed to be busy. She was not pining exactly. She was waiting, which was a different thing. Waiting implied confidence in the outcome. Pining implied doubt. She chose confidence. She wrote a letter to the address he had given her, Jane's address in St. Louis, brief and careful. She said she hoped the journey had been safe. She said Caldwell was cold. She said the chickens were laying well, which was something to be grateful for. She signed it simply with her name and included no return address because she did not want him to write back until he had something to write about. She found out later he had arrived in St. Louis in late November. She found that out from the letter he eventually sent, months later, which described the meeting with his sisters in such quiet detail that she sat down at the kitchen table to read it and had to read it twice. He described Jane opening the door and going entirely still for a full minute before she said his name. He described the dinner they had, the four of them, Jane and Clara and Lissy, who had come from Ohio when Jane wrote to tell her Robert had been in touch. He described the conversation they had about their mother and what was said and what was not said, and the particular peace that came from sitting in a room with women who had known him since he was small. He wrote, "I told them something of what I had been doing for the last several years and something of what I intended to stop doing. I did not tell them everything. I told them enough." Jane looked at me across the table and said, "You look like a man who has been pulled back from somewhere," and I said, "Yes, something like that." And she asked who pulled you, and I said a woman in Kansas, and there was a silence at the table that I believe contained a great deal of commentary. Maggie laughed at that, actually laughed, alone in her kitchen, and pressed her hand to her mouth to stop the sound. He had found work, he wrote. Not cattle work, at least not immediately. He had found work in a freight office through a man he had done right by years ago, a man named Sutherland who asked no particular questions and paid fair wages. He was renting a room from a widow woman on the east side of St. Louis, who he said was nothing like Maggie, which he appeared to mean as a compliment in some direction, though he was not entirely clear on which. He asked if he might write again. She wrote back and said yes. The correspondence that followed through the winter and into the spring was not a simple thing to describe. It was not the florid letter writing of romantic novels, all overblown declaration and theatrical longing. It was something more honest and more interesting. They wrote to each other the way they had talked across her kitchen table, directly and with attention, asking real questions and giving real answers. He wrote about the freight office, about St. Louis, about his sisters. He wrote about the small decisions of an honest life, the way the work felt different when it was clean, the way he slept differently, the way he had started going to church not because he felt immediately righteous, but because he had decided to become the kind of man who went to church, and he thought the habit had to precede the feeling. She wrote about the boarding house, about Caldwell, about the winter storms and the spring mud and the garden coming back to life in March. She wrote about Ruth Carey's new baby and old Peterson, the blacksmith, finally retiring, and the railroad work that was pushing through the southern edge of the county. She wrote about her own interior life with more candor than she had exercised with anyone since Thomas, more candor than she had exercised with Thomas, if she was honest, and the honesty of that was itself a kind of freedom. He wrote, "You told me once that what you had wanted in your marriage was to be known. I think about that often. I think the reason I am writing to you at such length, and with such regularity, is that you are the only person in my life with whom I feel that the version of myself I present in these letters is the actual version rather than a constructed one." She read that sentence 4 times. Then she got up and put water on for coffee and stood at the window looking at the April prairie, green and full of wind, and she thought that she was, without any remaining doubt, thoroughly in love with Robert Keating. Spring deepened into summer. He had been gone 8 months. He wrote in June that he had left the freight office. He had found work with a cattle operation outside the city, legitimate range work. A man named Hofstede, who ran a small but well-regarded outfit, and had been willing to take on a man who came with a recommendation from Sutherland and nothing else. He said the work felt right in a way that the freight office had not, that he was an outdoor man and always had been, and that being back with cattle but doing it correctly was a particular satisfaction he had not expected. He also said that he had been in contact with a lawyer regarding the warrant. This was the letter she read 3 times standing up in the kitchen, unable to sit down. He had, he wrote, engaged a lawyer in St. Louis named Kavanaugh who had experience with territorial warrants and their resolution. He had presented himself to Kavanaugh fully and honestly. Kavanaugh had reviewed the federal warrant, which had been issued in connection with the Crane Creek cattle rustling operation. Kavanaugh believed, given that Keating had not been the principal figure in the operation, and given a number of legal technicalities that he was not going to attempt to explain in a letter, that there was a path to a resolution. It would involve Keating making a full accounting to the federal office in Wichita. It would not be without risk or difficulty. But Kavanaugh thought it was the right action, and Keating had decided that if he was going to be an honest man, he had better be one all the way down to the foundation. Maggie sat down after reading this and put her hands flat on the table and breathed. She wrote back, she said, "I think you are the bravest person I know, and I do not say that lightly. I say it having known some brave people. Go to Wichita. Do what needs doing. I will be here." He wrote back, "I will be there before winter." He went to Wichita in August. He went with Kavanaugh and made a full accounting to the federal office, and told what he knew of Amos Carlyle and the Crane Creek operation. And the federal office, which had been wanting Carlyle for considerably more than cattle rustling by that point, found Keating's information valuable enough to negotiate a resolution. The warrant against Keating was reduced to a fine and a period of good behavior to be verified through letters from his employer and his lawyer. The fine was not small, but he had saved enough from his wages to cover it. He was not imprisoned. He came out of the federal office in Wichita in late August a free man in the eyes of the law for the first time in many years. He wrote her a letter from Wichita before he rode south. It said, "I am coming to Caldwell. I should arrive approximately 10 days after this letter. If that is not welcome, write to me at the Drover's Hotel in Wichita and I will know. If I do not hear from you, I will ride." She did not write to him at the Drover's Hotel in Wichita. She cleaned the boarding house from top to bottom. She baked. She planted the second-season kale because life went on, and the garden still needed tending even when your heart was doing unreasonable things in your chest. Ruth Carey came over on the Tuesday of the week she expected him, and found her in the kitchen in a state of unusual agitation, which for Maggie meant she had reorganized the pantry twice and was on her 3rd pot of coffee. Ruth Carey was a forthright woman of 35 who had been Maggie's closest friend since the year Thomas died, the kind of friend who showed up with soup without being asked and who noticed things without making a production of having noticed them. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Maggie for a moment and then said, "Who is coming?" Maggie looked at her. She thought about the months of silence she had kept, the careful privacy of it, and she thought that Ruth deserved better than a lie. "A man," she said. Ruth's eyebrows went up a fraction. It is a long story. I have the afternoon, Ruth said. Maggie told her. Not everything, not the part that constituted harboring a wanted man, but the shape of it. She said a man had been in trouble and she had helped him and he had gone away, and now he was coming back and he was an honest man now, and she found herself saying, rather considerably in love with him. Ruth Carey was quiet for a full minute. Then she said, I always thought you were too sensible. I am still sensible, Maggie said. Sensible women do not look the way you look right now, Ruth said comfortably, and poured herself more coffee. He arrived on a Thursday, the 14th of September, 1883. She was in the garden when she heard the horse on the road, and she straightened up and turned. He came through the gate on a bay horse she had not seen before, wearing a clean dark coat and a hat that looked newer than the one he had left in, and he was straight-backed and unhurried, and he looked exactly like himself except somehow more solidly placed in the world, as though the last 10 months had settled him into his own skin more completely than he had been when he arrived bleeding in her yard. He stopped the horse and dismounted and led it to the fence post and tied it. Then he walked toward her across the yard. She was standing between the rows of kale with dirt on her hands. He stopped 3 feet from her and looked at her for a moment and said, The garden looks excellent. You are 10 months late to have any opinion on my garden, she said. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully and openly, and it changed his face in a way that made her breath catch. I have a letter from Kavanaugh, he said, reaching into his coat, and one from Hofstede, and I have the resolution papers from the federal office in Wichita. I thought you should see them. Robert, she said, I want you to know everything is in order, he said. Robert, she said again. He stopped talking and looked at her. She walked the 3 feet between them and put her dirt-stained hands on either side of his face, and kissed him with 10 months of careful letters and sleepless nights and confident waiting behind it. And he put his arms around her very carefully because of the habit of protecting her from his own considerable situation. And then she felt him let the careful go, and he held her the way. A man holds something he has been afraid he might never have again. When she pulled back, she looked at him, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized because she had seen it once before, briefly, in the lamplight of a small room when he had whispered something to her in the dark and not known if she was awake. She had been awake. She had been completely awake. I need to speak to you properly, he said. His voice was a little unsteady. Yes, she said, you probably do. Not in the garden. There is coffee inside, she said. They went inside. He did not speak properly at the kitchen table, exactly. He spoke while standing at the kitchen window looking out at the garden, the same window she had stood at watching him ride away in the gray dawn. And he said that he had spent the past 10 months becoming the kind of man he would want to be if he were going to ask a woman like Maggie Merriweather to share her life with him, and that he did not know if he had arrived at that yet, but that he was closer than he had ever been, and that he was prepared to keep working at it for as long as it took. And that what he wanted, if she would have it, was to stay. Stay where, she said. He turned from the window and looked at her. Here, Caldwell, near you, in whatever form is right. I am not asking you to rush anything. I am asking you to know that I am not going anywhere. She looked at him steadily. What would you do for work? There is a ranch 5 miles east of town, he said, which told her he had been thinking about this for some time. Kendrick's outfit. I spoke with Kendrick in the spring when I was passing through. He has been looking for a range foreman. I have the experience and I have a letter from Hofstede. I believe the position is still available. You wrote to Kendrick. I wrote to Kendrick in July, he said. I was not going to come here without a plan. She looked at him for a moment. You planned all of this. I have been planning all of this since the day I rode out of here in October, he said simply. I had a great deal to think about on the road north. She was quiet. She looked at the table, at the 2 coffee cups, at the folded letters he had set out beside the lamp. She thought about the winter letters, the spring letters, the summer letters, all of them stacked in the box at the top of her wardrobe. She thought about the feeling of absolute solidity she had when she was in his company, the feeling that nothing was constructed or performed, that she was exactly who she was and he was exactly who he was, and the two of them together made a kind of sense she had not known was available to her. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them. No more running from anything. If there are problems, we solve them here and properly. Yes. You are honest with me about everything, all of it, past and present." "I am already that," he said. "I have been that in every letter." "I know," she said. "I am saying I require it to continue. It will continue." And she said and paused. And he said, "And I am not getting any younger, and I would like to be married before spring," she said, which was the most direct thing she had said to any human being in 2 years, and she said it looking straight at him without any particular embarrassment. The expression on his face went through several things very quickly. It landed on something so open and genuine that she had to look away for a moment. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said. "Yes." "Was that a proposal?" "It was a statement of intent," she said. "You may propose if you like. I believe it is customary." He crossed the kitchen floor and stood in front of her, and he took her hand and he said, "Maggie Merriweather, I am a former outlaw with a resolved federal warrant and a good character reference and a range foreman's position pending, and I love you more completely than I have ever loved anything, and I am asking you to marry me." "Yes," she said immediately, because life was short and she had already been sensible for 2 years, and it had been satisfying but somewhat limited. He kissed her again, without the careful restraint of the garden, and she kissed him back with the fullness of a woman who had decided that being known was worth all the risk that came with it. She told Ruth Carey that evening. Ruth cried, which Maggie had not expected, and said that she had known there was something different about Maggie for months, something lighter, and that she was the happiest person in Caldwell about this news except possibly Maggie herself. Maggie explained as much as she felt comfortable explaining. She did not tell Ruth about the harbor, the root cellar, the conversation with Marshal Boone. She told her about the correspondence, about his resolution of his legal situation, about his employment history, about his character. Ruth listened and asked sensible questions, and declared Robert Keating to be the most interesting thing to happen in Caldwell since the fire at Fletcher's store in the spring. Robert went to see Kendrick the next morning and came back that evening, with the range foreman's position confirmed. He was staying at the Caldwell Hotel, which was the proper arrangement, and he came to her table for supper each evening, which rapidly became a known thing in Caldwell in the way that all things became known things in small towns. Maggie did not particularly mind. She had been a private person, but she was not a secretive one, and there was nothing about Robert Keating, current edition, that she needed to hide. Some people in town were reserved about him. She had expected this. He was a stranger and a man who came from somewhere else and had a certain quality of history in his face that people noticed. Old Peterson, the retired blacksmith, gave him a narrow look the first time they met. The women at the Sunday gathering asked careful questions. Maggie answered them with the information she had, which was that he was an honest man with legitimate employment and a resolved legal past, and that she was going to marry him before spring, and that anyone who had something to say about it was welcome to say it to her directly. Nobody said anything to her directly. Old Peterson, after 2 weeks of observing Robert, allowed that he seemed like a capable man, and that the Kendrick operation had needed a proper foreman for years. Robert was good with the people of Caldwell. He was not a man who tried hard to be liked, which paradoxically made him easier to like. He was straightforward and helpful and remembered things people told him about themselves, their ailments and their family concerns and their opinions about the coming season, and he asked about those things when he saw them again. He helped Mrs. Franklin from across the road move a piece of furniture one afternoon without being asked. He spent a Sunday morning repairing the fence along the south side of Maggie's yard, which had been failing for 2 seasons. She watched him from the kitchen window while he worked, and felt something settle in her chest like the last piece of a complicated project finally placed. They were married in November, 6 weeks after his return, on a cold, bright Saturday at the Caldwell Presbyterian Church. The ceremony was attended by Ruth Carey and her husband, by Maggie's 2 current boarders, by Kendrick and his wife, by several of the women from the Sunday gathering who had apparently decided they approved, and by Robert's sister Jane, who had traveled from St. Louis specifically for the occasion, and who embraced Maggie at the church door with such warmth and immediacy that Maggie, who had not cried at her own first wedding, had to take a very firm grip on her composure. Jane Keating was 32 years old and had her brother's dark eyes and his directness and a laugh that filled a room. She and Maggie took to each other immediately, the way certain women do when they recognize a similar way of meeting the world. "I have to thank you," Jane said quietly while they waited for the ceremony to begin. "You do not," Maggie said. "I do. Whatever you did in Caldwell a year ago," she paused, her eyes bright. "I got my brother back. I want you to know I understand what that means." Maggie squeezed her hand and did not try to say anything, because some things are better held in silence. The ceremony was brief and warm, and the minister spoke well. Robert stood beside her with his shoulders back and his hat in his hands, and he said his vows in the steady, direct way he said everything, looking at her the whole time, and she said hers back with the same steadiness and the same directness, because they were 2 of a kind in that way. Afterward there was a supper at Ruth Carey's house, which was larger than Maggie's. Ruth had organized it in the way Ruth organized everything, thoroughly and with considerable food, and the evening was the kind of evening that Maggie stored in her memory deliberately, the way you put up preserves against the winter, knowing you will want them later. Jane told a story about Robert at age 12, attempting to convince their mother that the family cat had independently decided to move into the neighbor's house, and had nothing to do with Robert having accidentally left the door open. And Robert sat at the table with an expression of long-suffering dignity while everyone laughed. And Maggie looked at him across the table and felt a happiness that was not the volatile, bright kind but the deep kind, the kind that has room in it and does not need defending. They moved into the boarding house together as a working arrangement at first, Maggie managing the house and Robert working at Kendrick's ranch during the days. It suited them. The house was large enough, and they were people who valued their own space and respected each other's work. But after the first month she found herself realizing that the best hours of every day were the hours he was in the house, and she found him finding the same, evident in the way he came home earlier than his work strictly required on days when he knew she had tasks that could use a second pair of hands. They talked every evening the way they had written every week, with the same quality of attention. They talked about the ranch and the boarding house and the town and larger things, the political situation in the territory, the treatment of the Plains tribes who had been pushed further and further from lands that had been theirs, the question of what Kansas would look like in another decade, when the cattle drives were fully replaced by the railroad. Robert had opinions on all of these things, and so did Maggie, and they did not always agree, which she found to be one of the more unexpectedly satisfying aspects of being married to him. He had seen, in his years riding through the territory, things that most Caldwell residents had not seen close up. He had been in areas where the Cheyenne and Arapaho had been pushed off their land with a brutality that the official accounting rarely captured accurately. He spoke about it without sentimentality, but with a plainness that made it impossible to minimize. She listened and said what she thought, which was that the whole arrangement was a shameful one that history would not judge kindly, and he agreed, and they both understood that there was limited power in their position to change it, but that the acknowledgement of it mattered. These were conversations she had never had with anyone in Caldwell, not because the people of Caldwell were cruel, but because the comfortable life of a small town had a way of closing the view to what was immediately in front of you. Robert had lived without that comfort and without those walls, and it had given him a perspective that she valued. Winter passed. January was harsh and February was worse, and March came in like a threat, and through all of it they were warm. She had not known she was cold exactly. She had known she was alone. But there was a warmth that came from being truly known by another person that she had only read about in books before, and she found it was everything the books implied and then something beyond. In March she realized she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days, examining it from all angles before she told Robert. She told him on a Sunday morning, early, before either of them had fully gotten out of bed, because in the early morning there was a quality of softness between them that made important things easier to say. She said, "I think we are going to have a child." He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he went quiet when something mattered very much. Then he turned and looked at her in the morning light coming through the window. "Are you all right?" he asked, which was the right first thing. "Yes," she said. "I am surprised. I had thought at my age that perhaps it was not going to happen, but I am all right." He reached out and took her hand and held it. "I am," he paused, and she could hear him choosing words carefully. "I am very glad," he said. "In a way I do not have adequate words for at this hour of the morning." She laughed. He pressed his lips to her hair. "I am glad too," she said. I wanted you to know first." "Thank you," he said, meaning much more than the information. She was 32, and he was 35 when their son was born in October of 1884, a full year after Robert's return to Caldwell, in the same room where she had nursed Robert back from the edge of death, and where she had sat in the lamplight listening to him speak through his fever. She found this appropriate in a way she did not try to explain to anyone. He was a large, loud, healthy boy, and Robert stood at the side of the bed with an expression so thoroughly undone that she laughed at him, while she was still exhausted from the labor, which she told him later said a great deal about the power of his expression. They named him Thomas James Keating. Thomas for her first husband, because fairness mattered to her, and because Thomas Merriweather had been a good man who deserved to be remembered. James for Robert's father, the bookkeeper from St. Louis who had taught his son that numbers told the truth if you let them. Jane came for the birth. She had come twice now since the wedding, and each visit had deepened the friendship between her and Maggie into something that felt more like sisterhood than politeness. Jane held baby Thomas and said he had Robert's nose, which Robert disputed, and they argued about it cheerfully while the baby slept in Jane's arms, and Maggie lay back in the pillows and watched them and felt that the room was very full of something good. Robert Keating was, in the opinion of the people of Caldwell, a solid man. It had taken time, because solid was a thing you proved rather than declared, but by the time Thomas was born the opinion was essentially settled. He was good at his work. He was straight in his dealings. He was good to Maggie, which people noticed, because the quality of a man's goodness to his wife was something a small town observed and remembered. He was not dramatic about it. He did not make gestures. He was simply, consistently, attentively present, and over time that consistency built a reputation that required no maintenance because it maintained itself. Amos Carlyle, the man who had shot him, was arrested in the spring of 1884 by Marshal Boone in connection with a robbery in Indian Territory that had gone considerably further wrong than the cattle rustling had. He was sentenced at the federal court in Wichita and sent to the federal prison in the East. Maggie read about it in the Caldwell newspaper and set the paper down and thought about the wound in Robert's side, and the night she had first pressed her hand to it in the cold dark, and she felt something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but somewhere between the two. Robert read the same article and said nothing about it, which she had expected. He had not spoken about Carlyle since the early days of their acquaintance, and she did not press him. Some things belonged to a past that was genuinely past. Marshal Boone passed through Caldwell in the summer of 1884. She saw him on the street outside Fletcher's store, and their eyes met briefly. He tipped his hat to her with the same courtesy he had shown when he came to her door 2 years before. She nodded to him. Neither of them said anything. She walked on and he walked on, and that was the end of it. She told Robert about the encounter that evening. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "He is not a bad man. He was doing his job." "I know," she said. "If circumstances had been different, I might have respected him more directly," Robert said. "He was always thorough." She looked at him. "Is that how you think about it now, as though it were another world?" "It was another world," he said. "It was a different man's world. I was that man once and I am not now, and I prefer this one." He looked at her. "I prefer this one incomparably." "Good," she said. "So do I." Thomas grew into a serious, active boy who shared his father's observant quality and his mother's forthright speech. He was walking at 11 months and talking shortly after, and by the time he was 2, he was following Robert around the yard and the garden with the focused attention of a young man who had already decided what he found most interesting in the world. In the spring of 1887, 3 years after Thomas's birth, Maggie told Robert they were expecting a second child. This time the telling was at the kitchen table over the morning coffee, with Thomas sitting between them eating his porridge with great concentration. Robert looked at her across the table and smiled the smile she had come to regard as her private property, the one that had nothing performed about it and everything genuine. "Are you well?" he asked. "Entirely," she said. Thomas looked up from his porridge and said, "What?" With the sharp attention of a child who has noticed the quality of his parents' communication even before he understands its content. "Nothing for you yet," Robert said to him, ruffling his hair. "Eat your breakfast." Their daughter was born in November of 1887, a quiet baby with green eyes exactly the color of Maggie's, who they named Eliza Jane. The Eliza for no specific reason except that they both liked the sound of it, and the Jane for Robert's sister who deserved a namesake and who declared herself enormously honored. Jane came for the birth again, and this time she brought Clara, who had not been able to come before, and the Keating sisters and Maggie and Ruth Carey and the baby all occupied the house simultaneously for 3 days in a way that was chaotic and warm and full of talk and coffee. And Robert moved through it all with the air of a man who could not quite believe his good fortune, and was not going to say so aloud in case something changed. Eliza was a different child from Thomas. Where Thomas was serious and watchful, Eliza was social and cheerful, and greeted every new face with an enthusiasm that seemed to assume the world was fundamentally friendly, which her parents thought was an excellent starting assumption, and intended to support as long as possible. Thomas went to the Caldwell school and was, by his teacher's account, one of the better readers in his grade and one of the more talkative participants in classroom discussions, which his mother said she could have predicted, and his father said was no surprise given who his mother was. Maggie said that was a diplomatic way of saying it, and Robert said he stood by every word. In the spring of 1889, when Thomas was 4 and Eliza was 18 months, a man arrived in Caldwell who claimed to be a federal investigator and began asking questions in the saloon about past residents with connections to the Crane Creek outfit. Maggie heard about it from Ruth and waited one evening for the man to come to her because she expected he would. He did. He was a thin, bureaucratic-looking man named Wills who wore a suit rather than range clothes and had the self-important manner of someone who believed his office gave him more authority than it actually did. He asked about Robert Keating, his past, his current location. She told him that Robert Keating was her husband, that he had a resolved federal warrant that could be verified through the federal court in Wichita, that he was currently employed as range foreman at the Kendrick Ranch, and that she would suggest Wills do his verification before making any further inquiries in a town where Robert Keating had lived honestly for 6 years. Wills looked at her with the slightly deflated expression of a man who had expected less resistance and went away. He came back 2 days later looking more deflated and said that the warrant was indeed fully resolved and that he had no further questions. Maggie thanked him for confirming it and offered him coffee, which he declined. She told Robert about it that evening, and he sat quietly for a moment and then said, "That may happen again. I want you to know that I understand if it is difficult." "It is not difficult," she said. "It is annoying. There is a difference." He looked at her with the expression that meant he was grateful but was going to be dignified about it. "Robert," she said, "yes. You have been an honest man for 6 years. You have been a good husband and a good father and a good neighbor. If men with inadequate information want to come and ask questions, let them come. They will find the same thing every time." He was quiet for a long moment. "I know what I was," he said finally. "I do not think I will ever stop knowing it." "Good," she said. "It makes you careful, but knowing what you were and being defined by it are two different things." He looked at her. "When did you become a philosopher?" "I have always been a philosopher," she said. "You married me without reading the full specification." He laughed, really laughed, and the sound of it still had the quality that it had had that first time she heard it, something surprising and real and worth a great deal. Life in Caldwell moved forward in the way that life in small towns does, with the large events of the wider world arriving in the form of newspaper accounts and the occasional traveler, and the daily texture being made up of smaller things that accumulated into a full picture over time. The cattle drives were declining by the late 1880s as the railroads pushed further, and the range was fenced, and the wild openness of the early Kansas years gave way to something more settled. Caldwell itself changed with it, becoming more permanent, more layered. Robert moved from the foreman position at Kendrick's ranch to a partial partnership in 1890, when Kendrick decided to reduce his own active involvement and wanted a man he trusted to carry a stake in the operation. It was a considerable step and a considered one, and Maggie and Robert sat at their kitchen table for 3 evenings with the ledger sheets and the projections and the terms before they agreed it was right. The Kendrick operation, under Robert's management, did well. He was precise and fair in his dealings with the hands, and his reputation for honesty, which had been built from scratch in Caldwell over nearly a decade, served him well in the business transactions of the region. People knew Robert Keating's word was good, and in the cattle business of the Kansas plains, that was worth something very concrete. Thomas, at 7, announced that he was going to be a rancher, which his father received with carefully concealed emotion. Maggie saw the emotion anyway, as she saw most things about Robert, and when Thomas had gone to bed she said, "You did not know that was what you were going to give him." "No," he said, "I did not. Is that all right?" He looked at her and said, "More than all right," in a tone that closed the subject completely, because it had no further dimensions to explore. Eliza at 5 showed signs of being the kind of child who would be either a teacher or a significant problem for her parents, which Maggie told Robert was essentially the same thing. She had her mother's directness and her father's observational quality, and an additional social boldness that seemed to be purely her own. She was already reading, taught by Thomas with a patience that surprised both his parents, and she had opinions about most things. In the summer of 1891, 9 years after the night Maggie had found a bleeding stranger behind her chicken coop, she was standing in her garden at dusk when Robert came through the gate from the road and walked toward her with the end-of-day ease of a man who had done good work and was coming home to something better. He was 42 years old, and the lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened, and there was gray at his temples, but he moved with the same straight-backed quality he had always had, and his eyes were the same dark, steady eyes that she had first seen by lamplight, measuring a room and finding it safe. He stopped beside her in the garden. "Ruth says there is a sociable on Saturday," he said. "There is. Shall we go? We always go." "I know." He looked at the garden and then at her. "Thomas tells me he wants to spend the summer working on the south pasture fence line. He has a plan. He is 8. He has a detailed plan," Robert said with the particular pride he always kept just under the surface when he talked about the children. "He drew it out. The measurements are approximately correct." She smiled. "Of course they are." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with one hand, the easy habitual tenderness of someone who has been doing it for years. She turned her face briefly into his hand. "Are you happy?" she asked. She asked him this occasionally, not from insecurity but from genuine curiosity. She had found that asking people directly about their interior state produced more honest information than inferring it. He looked at her in the evening light of their garden, this man who had come to her bleeding and half dead, and had whispered something in the dark that had changed the direction of both their lives, and he said, "Maggie, I was a man who had given up on building anything. I told you that in this very kitchen 10 years ago." "Nearly 10 years," she said. "Nearly 10 years," he agreed. "And now I have a son who draws fence diagrams at age 8. And a daughter who is teaching herself to read before anyone taught her formally, and a ranch that runs right, and a home." He looked at her steadily. "And you? I have you. So yes," he said. "I am happy. I am the happiest I have ever been in my life, and I expect to be happier still, and that is an unusual situation for a man who once genuinely thought he would die behind someone's chicken coop in Kansas." She laughed and put her arms around him, and he held her in the summer-warm garden with the evening prairie wind moving through the kale and the sky going every shade of gold and rose above the western horizon. And it was the ordinary kind of happiness, the built kind, the daily kind, the kind that does not announce itself because it does not need to. She had never told anyone what he had whispered before he rode away. Not Ruth, not Jane, not a single soul in Caldwell or anywhere else. She had kept it the way she kept all the most important things, close and private and entirely her own. And some years later, when Eliza was old enough to ask her mother about how she and her father had come to be together, Maggie sat with her daughter in the kitchen in the afternoon light and told her the shape of the story. Not all of it. The legal matters were not for a child's ears, but the essential shape. That a man had come to her in great need and she had helped him, and they had written letters and he had come back. Eliza, who was 9 and had all the penetrating focus of both parents, said, "Did you love him right away?" Maggie thought about the lantern light and the cold yard, and the decision she had made without quite knowing she was making it. She thought about the kitchen table in the early mornings. She thought about the letter that had come from St. Louis in the winter and the laugh she had let out alone in her kitchen. "I think so," she said. "I think I did. I just needed time to know what I knew." Eliza considered this. "He did too." "Yes," Maggie said. "He did too." "He whispered something to you," Eliza said. "Before he left the first time. You mentioned it once, but you never said what." Maggie looked at her daughter's green eyes and her father's steady gaze and smiled. "No," she said, "I never did." "Will you ever tell anyone?" Maggie thought about the small storeroom, the lamplight, the thin, unsteady pulse under her fingers, the slow, careful work of her hands, and the 2 days of fever, and the kitchen table, and the letters, and the garden, and the wedding in November, and the children, and the ranch, and the years of evenings with coffee and straight talk, and the particular happiness of being completely known by another person. She thought about his voice in the dark, quiet and certain, saying what he said. "No," she said. "Some things are only for the people they belong to." Eliza looked satisfied with this answer, in the way that children are satisfied when adults treat them seriously rather than simply shutting the door. She went back to her book, and Maggie went back to her mending, and the afternoon sun moved across the kitchen floor the way it had been moving across that floor for 10 years now, from the east window to the west window, in the house that had become a home and the life that had become the one she had always wanted and not quite known she was waiting for. Robert came home that evening as he always did, steady and quiet and present, and Thomas ran at him from the barn door and was caught and lifted without ceremony, and Eliza called something from the kitchen window, and the prairie evening settled around the house the way it did in autumn, gold and wide and smelling of grass. And Maggie stood at the door and watched it all and kept her secret, as she had always kept it, as she would always keep it. Because some things were only for the people they belonged to, and this one belonged entirely to them.